Before you can know the truth about God, you first have to know how to know the truth. And spoiler alert, Geisler and Turek don't. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. Well, we paid our dues. We slogged our way through their tedious attempt to use a cartoon roadrunner to overthrow some of the most prodigious advancements in philosophy and science since the days of the ancient Greeks. And now we's due for some fun. This next section is entitled, How is Truth Known? And already I can tell things is looking up. The topic of how to tell what's true from what's false is a topic I find particularly enjoyable, not to mention downright useful. Geisler and Turek, of course, ain't going to contribute much to our understanding, but they's going to leave us some sizable holes to fill in, and I, for one, welcome the opportunity. They start off with a quick review of what they think they've accomplished so far. Quote, "Let's sum up what we've seen so far. Truth exists, and it is absolute and undeniable. To say truth cannot be known is self-defeating because that very statement claims to be a known absolute truth. If you say that someone's position is wrong, you must know what is right in order to say that. You can't know what is wrong unless you know what is right." End quote. Right away, we see the kind of absolutist binary thinking that underlies their approach to what they call the truth. Never mind what they said before about knowledge being, at best, 95% certainty about something. If you claim to know something, you're claiming to have a known absolute truth. And notice the awkward wooden usage of the passive voice here. By making the discussion about how truth is known instead of about how we can know the truth, Geisler and Turek is creating a dichotomy between knowing truth and not knowing truth. We ain't talking here about how we know the truth about something. We's talking about either knowing truth, singular, or not knowing truth, singular. That's binary thinking, either or, black and white. And that's a problem because the question ain't about can we know truth singular. It's about, or at least it ought to be about, how we can tell the difference between what's reliably true and what ain't. Also, like we said before, it's demonstrably false to say that you can't know an answer is wrong unless you know what's right. Not only is it possible to recognize a wrong answer without knowing the right one, it's very often easier. You don't have to know the exact value of the square root of 2 before you can know that it ain't 77. You don't have to know who wrote the epistle to the Hebrews to know that it weren't Sherlock Holmes. For every right answer, there's a potentially infinite number of wrong ones, and some, if not most, of the wrong answers is going to be obviously wrong. And that's going to be particularly important when it comes to recognizing wrong answers about God. So right off the bat, Geisler and Turek is mistaken about how we tell the difference between right answers and wrong ones. Let's continue. They told us what they think they've established so far, and now they's ready to teach us how to know truth, singular. Quote, "The process of discovering truth begins with the self-evident laws of logic called first principles. They are called first principles because there is nothing behind them. They are not proven by other principles. They are simply inherent in the nature of reality and are thus self-evident. So you don't learn these first principles, you just know them. Everybody intuitively knows these principles, even if they haven't thought about them explicitly." End quote. Okay, partial credit for recognizing that the laws of logic is inherent in the nature of reality, or rather that certain patterns are inherent in the nature of reality, and we've formulated what we call the laws of logic in order to describe those patterns. But everybody intuitively knows them? If only. We ain't Vulcans, folks. We discover the logical constraints of objective reality as we experience them, but it ain't automatic, and folks don't always get it right, as Geisler and Turek themselves is going to demonstrate for us in a minute. But in the meantime, they do go over some of these logical principles. They specifically mention the law of non-contradiction and the law of the excluded middle, and they go on to declare that without the first principles, we wouldn't be able to learn anything at all. And so far, so good. Then they discuss logical syllogisms like, if X is true, then Y is true. X is true, therefore Y is true. And they point out that this is valid reasoning, but they also point out that even valid logical reasoning can lead to false conclusions if you start from any false premises. And they give some examples of false premises leading to false conclusions. And again, so far so good. They correctly identify this kind of reasoning as deduction and contrast it with induction, where we make some relatively large number of observations and then derive some general principle based on our observations. Like saying the sun comes up every morning based on the fact that we've repeatedly seen the sun come up every morning. And they correctly point out that induction does not guarantee that the general principle is going to be 100% correct 100% of the time. Just like David Hume said. But despite this, induction can lead to a very high degree of certainty, even if it's less than 100%, and there's many cases where we can consider things to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt based on induction. And of course, being apologists, they have to phrase that observation in terms of having faith in the conclusion. Which brings us to the first big hole in their reasoning. Because you see, actually there's two different kinds of faith. There's reality-based faith, based on objective, repeatable, and verifiable observations of objective reality. And then there's faith-based faith, where you believe things more or less because you believe them. Because somebody told you, because your feelings led you to believe, or whatever. And these are two very different kinds of faith. Reality-based faith means believing things that's consistent with what we can reliably and verifiably observe in objective reality. And since truth means that which is consistent with objective reality, that means reality-based faith is really just believing that the truths we don't know yet is going to be most likely going to be consistent with the truths that we've already observed. Which is basically the same thing as saying that truth is going to be consistent with reality whether we know them or not. And that's a very reasonable, skeptical kind of faith. Faith-based faith, on the other hand, is what folks believe despite what we can reliably, repeatably, and verifiably observe in objective reality. It's faith for the sake of faith alone. In fact, some folks measure how strong their faith-based faith is by how much verifiable real-world evidence they can reject in favor of their own personal beliefs. The stronger the insistence on one's own personal belief despite the evidence, the greater the virtue of their faith. That's why faith-based faith is such a profound achievement that it deserves to be rewarded with eternal bliss in heaven. Anybody can have reality-based faith, but if you have faith-based faith, then that means you're a uniquely spiritual and virtuous individual. Supposedly. So yeah, maybe it takes a little reality-based faith to believe that tomorrow's going to have another sunrise, but that don't lend any credibility at all to faith-based faith. These two completely different and incompatible kinds of faith. Let's move on. Geisler and Turek covered deduction and its limitations, and they've covered induction and some of its limitations. But there's a whole lot more that we need to know if we want to be able to tell what's really true and what ain't. It ain't enough to know what deduction and induction are. We also have to know how to apply them. We need to know what errors and fallacies to avoid, and how to reliably collect and analyze our data, and how to generate hypotheses and test them, and then after we test them, how to refine or discard them depending on how the tests turn out. All Geisler and Turek has given us so far is just enough of a naive understanding of logic to be able to convince ourselves that certain things is true even when they ain't. For Geisler and Turek to stop here would be a major disservice to their readers and would set them up for some classic frauds and swindles and other deceptions designed to appeal to the gullible and unprepared. Spoiler alert again, this is where Geisler and Turek end their discussion of how to know what's true and what ain't. their discussion of how to know truth, singular. And that's leaving out a whole heap of important stuff. For example, they neglect to mention that when you're trying to find the truth, you can't start out by deciding what the truth ought to be and then cherry pick the evidence and build your argument so as to reach the conclusions that you want. If we want to know the truth, there's a disciplined methodology that we need to follow based on the fact that our standard of truth is objective reality itself. Now, objective reality is consistent with itself, which means both that it don't contradict itself and that every truth is connected to other truths. So, when we make a truth claim that's actually true, it's going to be consistent with objective reality, and it's also going to imply other truths, which is also going to be consistent with objective reality. And that implies a procedure we can use to test truth claims. We can take a truth claim and then ask ourselves, what other truth claims is implied if this claim is true? This gives us a list of observations we can look for in the real world to test whether or not our claim is true. If we find the things that our claim implies ought to be there, then our claim is more likely to be true. And if they ain't, then it's less likely. And notice, these other things don't have to be in the future. A lot of folks describe these implied truths as predictions, which gives the misleading impression that you can't apply this method to stuff that happened in the past. But that ain't so. One truth implies other truths. So a truth that happened in the past is going to imply other truths that also happened in the past. And that gives us something to look for to see if the original truth claim is likely to be true. And we can get even better results by comparing two conflicting truth claims. For example, we can compare the claim, God is the creator, with the claim, God is a myth. Each truth claim implies other truths that we ought to be able to observe if the claim is true. If we find that we're continually having to add new ad hoc assumptions in order to avoid falsifying our original claim, that's a sign that our original claim is more likely to be false. If you compare a true claim with a false one, you'll find that the true claim fits easily and naturally into our verifiable observations of the real world with consequences that line up neatly with the implications of our original claim. Whereas the false claim is going to be inconsistent with our verifiable observations and is going to be continually adding new ad hoc assumptions that ain't implied by the original claim. And we need to understand this and be ready to apply it whenever we need to know what's true and what ain't. But Geisler and Turek never even mention it, and I can't say for sure they even know it. After skipping most of the essential parts of a discussion about what's necessary in order to know the truth, Geisler and Turek simply move on to a section entitled, How Are Truths About God Known? Still using that awkward passive voice, but at least they's finally acknowledging that more than one thing can be true. And you remember what I said before about how Geisler and Turek was going to give us a demonstration of how we don't all intuitively know the principles of logic? Check out their answer to the question of how we can know truths about God. Quote, just as a book requires pre-existing human intelligence, are there any observable effects that seem to require some kind of pre-existing supernatural intelligence? In other words, are there effects that we can observe that point to God? The answer is yes, and the first effect is the universe itself. End quote. Oh boy, you guys didn't need to prove my point that hard. But yeah, this is definitely a good example of why knowing the definitions of deduction and induction ain't enough. They think we can know truths about God by turning to primitive superstitions. No wonder the philosophies of Hume and Kant rubbed them the wrong way. Here's a pro tip. You can't discover the truth by making an argument of the form, if X exists, then it can do things that science can't explain. These things that science can't explain, therefore X exists. That's a fallacy, and I'll leave you all to figure out exactly which one, just for fun. Beyond that, we ain't going to go into this in too much detail now, because they's just giving us a taste of what the next 5 chapters is going to be like. Yeah, the next 5 chapters. Boy, howdy. But meanwhile, let's finish out chapter 2 because there's only one section left and it's mostly a rehash of the introduction, so it won't take long. The last section is entitled, So What? Who Cares About Truth? And notice we's back to truth singular again. Anybody who rejects Christianity is rejecting truth singular. And the consequences is going to be disastrous. And that's basically this whole section in a nutshell. They rehearse their opening conspiracy theory about how American society in general has rejected truth and morality, and consequently everything's going to hell, literally. They renew their call to Christian theocracy by claiming that all legislation is legislating somebody's morality, with the implication being that Christian morality is somehow unfairly discriminated against. Then they argue that truth, singular, matters because, well, Pascal's wager, except they modify it slightly to say that, oh, if Islam is true, then Christians is in trouble, and vice versa. And oh, by the way, if atheism is true, then we should all just lie and cheat and steal because consequences can't exist without eternal life, and atheists is all cartoon villains who exist only to sin and something, I don't know. And then the Islamophobia kicks in. They start ranting about Muslims being anti-Semitic and wanting to do a big jihad on everybody who ain't Muslims. And kids grow up to commit crimes because of evolution being taught in the public schools. And wasn't Mother Teresa nice? Which I guess is supposed to prove that morality affects real life somehow. And that society is actually out to get us and we need to fight back by all becoming Christians. Basically, one big altar call for conspiracy theorists. Please rise for the offertory. So that brings us to the end of chapter 2, and good riddance. The big takeaway here seems to be that Geisler and Turek resents having been exposed to some of the greatest philosophers of the Western world and actively resisted learning anything useful from them. They prefer naive and error-prone approaches to deciding what's true and what ain't, and they's out to teach other believers to do the same. The only positive side is that they started giving us the opportunity to present better approaches and to highlight the problems with their approach, which is what we'll be doing for the rest of this book. And that about does it for me for today. Next time we're going to start on chapter 3, which is entitled, In the Beginning There Was a Great Surge, with the word surge in all caps. Sounds dramatic, right? Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.